After what seemed like an eternity of puttying and sanding and checking for light leaks and puttying more and sanding more and rechecking for light leaks, I believe I've gotten to the point that I've mitigated all the light leaks coming from around the seams of the saucer connection between the upper and lower saucer. I also had some problems in just a few places of ghosting coming through the bottom of the saucer rim. I guess I once again didn't hit it with enough coats of the black paint sealer. What I did for those areas is used tulip and very carefully painted thin coats with a paintbrush and went back and lightly sanded. You have to be careful with tulip when trying to use as a paint. It is very thick and it dries a little bit lumpy. So if you're not careful, you get sort of an uneven finish. But if you put on thin coats with paintbrush and lightly sand between each coat, it will mitigate the ghosting. As it is now, there are just a few places in the absolute dark from underneath. If you squint and look hard enough, you'll see some faint ghosts, but I don't think anyone is ever going to go to that much trouble. So I'm going to go with this. I have masked the upper saucer very carefully because what I want to do is hit with Tamiya fine white primer just around this rim. I have masked the upper and then lower portion of the saucer. Again, being very careful, as I mentioned in a previous chapter, there's the Aztec and registry decalings in here, so I was masking and applying the adhesive, the blue painter's tape around this edge. But for now, I am going to fire up the light box and hit this rim with a few coats of the Tamiya fine white primer, and then hopefully we'll be able to move on from sealing and puttying and sanding and resealing the upper saucer rim. Got all of the masking material carefully removed from the upper and lower saucer, as well as the areas around the hull and the areas protecting the base. And I'm happy to say that there was no overspray from any of the careful painting around the rim. Nothing has contaminated or bled onto the Aztec decals under the saucer and the registry markings under the saucer, as well as the dorsal neck. I've got a little bit of a two-tone finish just up under here, under the saucer lip, where you can see a faint bit of a mask line where the new coat's a little bit wider than the old coat, but I think I should be able to buff that out with some fine grit sandpaper, and I believe the Aztec decals will hide that as well. But you really have to get up under here and look straight up to even see that it's there. One of the things that I forgot to mention in the last segment when I talked about using tulip to come in and carefully paint some of the worst of the light leaks and a little bit of the ghosting areas, is to minimize the amount of fine spray coats that I was going to do once everything was masked up. You know, it would take several coats just to bring that dark black tulip up to a baseline, and then a few coats over that as well to come up to this nice shiny white finish. So what I did was I used Liquitech titanium white latex paint, and I very carefully brush painted over the tulip just a couple of thin coats, which brought it up to a fine white gray, so that it really only took hitting it with one coat of the Tamiya fine white primer to get it to a nice white, and then two more fine dustings, and I've got a really great look, nice great white even color around the rim. At this point now I can start with the Aztec decaling on the upper saucer. I can finish out the Aztec decaling on the under saucer. I first have to come in and paint the RCS thrusters yellow, and then these phaser banks yellow as well. Then I should be able to start laying down the Aztec decals on the saucer. But the most important thing is that, yes, I have mitigated all of the light leaks around the saucer rim, and I'll have to say that this lady really looks fantastic lit up. Eileen likes to say, when you see it completely in the dark like this, all lit up, that it's almost like looking at a city or a nice big building. The strobe, the navigation lights from the antenna controls looks fantastic. And again, there is no light leaks, no seams coming around from around the edge of the saucer. You know, I've been talking with Matt of Matt's Model Shop again about the two-step process of mounting the lower saucer first to the dorsal and then mounting the upper saucer. One of the things that he said that he hoped would be an outcome of that is that it would cut down on the light leaks right under here, the attachment of the dorsal, the upper dorsal neck to the saucer, and he was pleased when he did this method that it did, and myself as well. I mentioned in an earlier chapter that there were just one or two little light leaks that was on the starboard side. There were none on the port side. On my first build, there were a ton of light leaks along that seam, and it took forever carefully going up under here with head and hands to get rid of those light leaks. Very happy to say that the saucer looks fantastic, and now we can move forward to other parts of this build. Chapter 14 is going to be dedicated to making all the final connections and soldering for this spaghetti-like mass of wires coming out of the front of the secondary hull, connecting to the wiring in the deflector dish, and then sealing all of this up. I did go ahead and get started on the nacelles, giving them a couple of coats of the Tester's flat black paint for light blocking, a couple on the inside, a couple on the outside, and then some coats of Tamiya fine white primer on the outside, followed up by a couple of coats of just plain Krylon white primer on the inside for reflective capabilities. I may go in and hit that with a little bit of chrome finish too to really maximize the reflective capabilities. But finally started on the nacelles, so that's a good start. Next, I want to have mail call because I had been working on the lighting for the deflector dish for the RCS thrusters, and I had first attempted to use these, which will be hard to see, but they're the little Pico Nano LED lights that did such a great job casting floodlights from the Bridgestone and from the lower planetary sensor on the lower saucer. And so I placed them around in here to try to cast a good light out for the RCS thrusters. If you take a look here, you can see that the RCS thrusters are really just two tiny pinpoints of light for each of the thrusters around the deflector housing. So in my attempts to use those little Pico lights, they really did not give that look. They look really more like just headlamps around the edge. So I ordered from Evans Design 3mm LEDs, and this is where Evans Design proved how really awesome they are, because I ordered the lights after about a week. They had not come in. I checked through the Postal Service, the delivery mechanism. They said there was some kind of delay, and we were looking at perhaps up to 3 weeks to get them, which was really a lot slower than I wanted it to be. I reached out to Evans, and they said, no, that's just not acceptable, and actually did an overnight for a replacement set of 4 of the little 3mm amber lights. So if the other ones eventually come in, I'll just hit return to sender and send them right back. But I have hit the inside of the deflector housing, dish housing, with reflective chrome paint, and then gone in. These are little clear parts. There's 4 that go around the deflector housing. I gave them a couple coats of Testors flat black on either side, then went in with a small Dremel bit and drilled little holes here very carefully. Then made sure I cleared out all the debris from the holes. Gave them a couple coats of a light yellow paint on one side. Had to go in and drill out holes here on the inside of the deflector dish, and then kind of square them off with a hobby knife. And after a couple of tests, I've got a really good finish of providing those 2 little spots for the RCS thrusters. Now the next step is going to be coming back in and applying the Lake Monster light diffuser here, which back in chapter 4 I showed what a great job this does in diffusing the light coming from the amber changing to blue Tenna Controls LED light. Before that, let's take a look at what I ended up doing with the clear part that goes on the front of the deflector dish housing. I went back and forth trying to decide whether I was going to take the time to do the radial spoke rings on the inside of the deflector dish. Sometimes when I see builds that have this, I think it really looks great. Sometimes I think it's very distracting. In the end, I decided that the only reason that I was not going to do it would be just sheer laziness. So I motored on. Watched some videos. Boyd at TrekWorks, as always, had some great recommendations for what to use and how to apply them. So most builders who apply these radial spoke rings use this material, polystyrene strips, in this size here, and I cut them I cut one to shape and used it as a template, and then going with a technique that Boyd described, would take one at a time, and I had a little dish that I pulled up some Testors canopy glue, and I would dip one end and then another end, so I had a little canopy glue on each end, and then very carefully drop it into place. There's the raised rings that go around. There's 32, I believe, raised rings. So once you put it into place, then come back with a hobby knife and gently scooch it into place. Now, they tend to want to lean over to one side or the other, and what I discovered was that if you give the canopy glue just a few minutes to begin to set up, you could ease them over and then they would stand up straight. I also discovered that you really only have about 10 minutes before that canopy glue pool starts to set up and get a little bit gummy. And so I would have to wipe it off and start all over again. I basically did this in 2 steps. The first night I laid down half of them. It took a little bit over an hour. Earlier this afternoon I went in and did the other half. I guess I've gotten a little bit better at it because it only took about 45 minutes or so to do the other half, but in looking at it, I'm really glad I did. That's a fantastic finish. I had gone in earlier and dusted the back side of this deflector dish canopy with Krylon flat finish. I gave it about 2 fine dustings to give it a nice light fog to help diffuse the light. I also went in with the Peekaboo Blue that is used for a lot of the detail and did around this rim right here, trying to mask this piece to do that little rim of paint was also really tricky, but in the end I love these radial rings. I've done a light test with them and they really look fantastic. I'm happy I went to that trouble. Now the next step is going to be this piece, which is a ring that goes around the deflector dish canopy. This ring is one of the main reasons that I got the Paragraphics photo etch, because I love the look of this ring, the way that the light shines through it. So I gave it 2 coats on each side of Testors Flat Black, then came back and on one side gave it a couple coats of Tamiya Haze Gray. There is an orientation to how it's supposed to go. The Paragraphics instruction sheet shows, there's smaller rings that go around the edge, and then at 4 points there's a longer opening, a longer ring, and they correspond with the same spacing in here. So I'll have to be very careful in putting that in place to make sure that they correspond. Throughout all of this, I highly recommend using these. I think I'm about my 3rd or 4th pair of these. They're not really expensive, less than $20. They tend to fall apart after several months use, but they are essential tools. These magnifying visors with lights. I could never have done the fine detail work of these radial spoke rings. Again, this is a look that I love, and I really can't wait to see what it's going to look like when it's set in the deflector dish, especially when backed with that diffusion disc that will go on the bottom of the deflector, and see the amber and then changing blue tenant controls light coming through this. So it has been a long and full Saturday of very carefully making connections, soldering wires together, multiple tests, multiple lighting tests with 9-volt battery, and then final connections. All the massive wiring that was hanging out of the front of the secondary hull. Once everything was connected, and again multiple tests to make sure that everything was still working, very carefully folded all the wiring into the secondary hull, and prepare for affixing the deflector dish housing into place. I had a slight moment of panic. This was a long and sometimes very fraught operation. After I had soldered everything and I had done a test prior to soldering and everything worked right, that the saucer rim lights and the floodlight, Bridgestone floodlights, didn't light up. So I had to go back in and poke and prod and figure out why, and I found a loose connection, not at the solder joint, really coming out of where the wires were coming out of the top of the secondary hull. So I had to do a little bit of splicing, got all of that working, all of that in place, and again further lighting test shows that the system is working great. So now it's time to go in and affix the deflector dish housing into here. I'm going to use canopy glue in case I ever at some point need to crack this thing back open and get in. This piece is a very tight fit. It gave me a lot of trouble on my first build. I went ahead and put glue on it and then tried to cram it all together and really fought with it. Ended up having to let the glue dry and scrape it all off. So I did some test fitting. It's still a really tight fit. I sanded around this rim, and particularly these points right here. There seemed to be a choke point right here where this bottom unit really did not want to go in very well, but I've scraped this away with a hobby knife, done a lot of sanding around the rim. Now it all goes together in a really, really tight fit. So it's time to get out the canopy glue and seal up the secondary hull. So the deflector dish assembly is now fully affixed into place. It went in mostly easily because, like I said, I had done some test fittings, found some of its sticky points, and gone in and done some sanding and a little bit of scraping with a hobby knife. Like I said on my first build, I really had to fight to get this thing in place. I affixed glue to it and it simply wouldn't fix. Then I had to take it off, let the glue dry, completely sand it all off. And do a lot of cajoling, but with a little test fitting and a little prep work, it snapped into place pretty easily. Again, I use canopy glue in case for any reason I ever have to pop it back off, which I hope I never do. Also, in my first build, I had gone ahead before putting the deflector dish onto the front of the secondary hull and done the Aztec decals. I reasoned that it would be easier to be able to have it in my hand and turn it over and around to put those Aztec decals into place, which I guess it was. But in trying to manhandle it into place, also marred those decals to some degree. So I left them off this time. Need to do a little bit of puttying in here to take care of this line. That's not a big deal. There's of course these little pieces, these little nerney pieces that will go into place. This lady is looking fantastic, very enterprisey. I love the deflector dish amber to blue. So now the next step is going to be the nacelles and of course a crap ton of Aztec and registry decaling, but we are sort of getting into the home stretch with this build. Chapter 15 will pick up with a lot of the work on the nacelles. So join me as we continue and get close to the finish line and the launch of the 1350 Refit Enterprise.